Margaret Ellis knew she had already been forgotten the moment she stepped into the café and saw every woman holding a ribbon or a rose except her, and before she could decide whether to turn back, Lucas Reed saw her pause in the doorway and understood exactly what that hesitation meant. He had arrived early, as he always did, choosing the chair near the entrance out of habit rather than comfort, but the way she stood there, composed, quiet, pretending not to measure the room, pulled his attention away from everything else. Valentine's laughter filled the air, men leaning across tables, packages sliding over polished wood, promises exchanged as if affection were an annual obligation, and Margaret moved through it with steady steps that did not falter, even when she realized there was no place waiting for her. She chose the small table by the window, the one that had never once held a bouquet, and sat as though solitude were a decision rather than a result. Lucas did not look away. He noticed the way the waitress set down tea too quickly, the way nearby voices softened into polite whispers, the way no one invited her to join their celebration, because widowhood made people uncertain where kindness should begin and end. 5 years had passed since her husband's death, yet the town still treated her presence on Valentine's Day as something slightly inconvenient, as if hope past 30 were an error. A man across the room joked loudly that some women preferred independence to disappointment, and Margaret's chin lifted just enough to keep her dignity intact, though her hands tightened around the cup. Lucas felt the shift in the room the way one feels pressure before a storm. Not loud, not violent, but unmistakable. And he understood that the worst part of cruelty was not insult, but erasure. She would leave soon. He knew that, before the absence at her table became too obvious even for her composure to hide. The realization settled in him without drama. If he did nothing, he would be part of the silence. Lucas stood. The scrape of his chair cut through the café more sharply than laughter had, and heads turned not because he was the loudest man there, but because he rarely moved without purpose. He crossed the room slowly, passing bouquets and red ribbons, ignoring the curiosity that followed him, and stopped directly in front of Margaret's table. She looked up, surprised, guarded but steady, and Lucas removed his gloves with deliberate calm before placing a small wrapped box in the center of the empty wood. "For you," he said, voice even, not loud, not apologetic. Conversations thinned instantly, forks paused mid-air, and Margaret stared at the gift as if unsure whether it was meant for someone behind her. Lucas did not explain himself, did not smile to soften the moment. He simply pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, making it clear that this was not pity, not spectacle, but choice. The café watched in stunned quiet as the widow no one had remembered became the woman someone had publicly chosen, and Margaret felt something inside her shift, not because of what was in the box, but because Lucas Reed had just decided, in front of everyone, that she would not sit alone on Valentine's Day again. Lucas did not look at the crowd after sitting down across from Margaret. He looked only at her, as if the café had emptied the moment he made his choice, and that steady focus made the silence around them heavier than any accusation. Margaret's fingers still rested on the small, wrapped box, but now the weight in the room had shifted from her empty table to the man who had dared to fill it. "Lucas," she said quietly, not in protest but in warning, because she understood this town well enough to know that public gestures carried consequences. Yet he answered before she could finish by telling her he was not mistaken. The firmness in his voice was not loud, but it traveled clearly, and a chair scraped somewhere behind them as someone stood abruptly. A man near the stove muttered that Valentine's Day was for couples, not sympathy, and another replied that widows ought to know when to step aside. And though the comments were not directed at Lucas directly, they hung between the tables like a challenge waiting to be accepted. Lucas finally turned his head slightly, not to argue, but to acknowledge that he had heard them, and the simple acknowledgement unsettled more than anger would have. Margaret felt the urge to diffuse the tension before it grew sharper, to laugh lightly and say it was only a friendly gesture. But she stopped herself because minimizing the moment would turn his decision into something smaller than it was. She untied the ribbon slowly, aware that every movement was being watched, and when she opened the box and saw the blue gloves folded carefully inside, she did not smile for the crowd. She looked at Lucas instead. He did not explain the gift with romantic flourishes or apologies. He simply said that he had noticed her mending the old pair again last week and thought she deserved better. The room shifted again, this time not in mockery, but in discomfort, because noticing required attention, and attention implied care, and care was harder to dismiss as pity. Mrs. Dalton leaned forward at her table and asked, just loud enough to carry, whether Lucas believed it wise to encourage expectations where none should exist, and Margaret felt heat rise in her chest. Not from shame this time, but from anger at being spoken about rather than to. Before she could answer, Lucas responded calmly that he was not encouraging anything except respect, and if that made anyone uneasy, the discomfort did not belong to Margaret. The words were measured, deliberate, leaving no opening for laughter or insult, and for a moment the café seemed unsure how to proceed. A younger ranch hand snorted that choosing a widow on Valentine's Day looked desperate, and Lucas met his eyes without raising his voice and said that desperation was pretending not to see someone standing alone when you had the ability to change it. The quiet authority in the reply stripped the comment of its effect, and the ranch hand looked away first. Margaret closed the box carefully, holding it not like a token, but like proof that she had not imagined the shift in the air. Lucas leaned back slightly, still seated, still calm, making it unmistakable that he was not there for spectacle, but for presence. And as conversations slowly resumed, softer now, more cautious, Margaret understood that the real gift was not the gloves in her hands, but the fact that he had chosen her in front of everyone, and had no intention of stepping back when the room turned against him. The café eventually returned to movement, but the rhythm had changed, and Margaret felt it as soon as she stepped outside with the small box held close against her coat, because silence followed her not like emptiness, but like curiosity sharpened into judgment. Lucas walked beside her without crowding her, not touching her arm, not claiming closeness that had not yet been offered, and that restraint gave her enough steadiness to lift her chin when the first whisper floated across the boardwalk. "It won't last," someone said softly behind a gloved hand, and another voice answered that men like Lucas only entertained themselves for a season, and Margaret understood immediately that the town would not challenge his courage directly, but would try to erode her confidence instead. She stopped near her dress shop door and turned to him before entering, asking whether he realized what he had stirred up by crossing that café floor. And he answered without hesitation that he had stirred up what was already there. Only now it had nowhere to hide. The honesty unsettled her because it forced her to admit that the loneliness she had endured quietly wasn't invisible at all. It had simply been convenient for others to ignore. Inside the shop, the afternoon light fell across unfinished dresses and neatly folded fabrics, and Margaret placed the box carefully on the counter, as if setting down something fragile but powerful. She asked him why he had chosen today rather than any other ordinary morning, and Lucas replied that ordinary mornings were precisely the problem. People preferred injustice in small doses, spread thin enough to overlook, but Valentine's Day made absence impossible to disguise. The explanation did not feel romantic. It felt intentional, and that intention frightened her more than gossip ever could. A knock sounded against the doorframe, and Mrs. Dalton entered without invitation, smiling too tightly as she remarked that public gestures created unnecessary attention, especially for women in delicate positions. Margaret felt the old reflex to apologize rise in her throat, yet Lucas remained where he stood, not defensive, simply present, and the steadiness of his silence gave her the courage to answer that attention only became dangerous when it was forced into shadows. Mrs. Dalton's smile faltered, and she left with a warning that towns remembered disruptions longer than they forgave them. When the door closed, Margaret exhaled slowly and asked Lucas whether he was prepared for that kind of memory to follow him, and he said he had lived long enough to know that silence also left a record. The weight of his words settled into her thoughts as the afternoon stretched on, customers entering with polite curiosity, their glances drifting toward the small box on the counter before quickly retreating. By evening, the story had already traveled beyond the café, reshaped and exaggerated, some claiming he intended marriage, others insisting it was pity dressed as romance, and Margaret realized the town would not allow the moment to remain simple. Lucas prepared to leave as the light faded, telling her he would return tomorrow as usual, not to prove anything, but because he had made no gesture he intended to retract. When he stepped back onto the boardwalk, he did not look back to measure reaction, and Margaret watched him walk away with a mixture of gratitude and fear, knowing that the whispers gathering in the dusk were not aimed at her alone anymore. Valentine's Day had ended with her no longer forgotten, but the choice that changed her table had awakened something restless in the town, and she sensed that the quiet courage Lucas carried would soon be tested in ways far less comfortable than a silent café. By morning, the town had chosen its tone, and it was not outrage but correction, the kind that pretended to be concern while pushing quietly toward retreat. Lucas felt it first at the feed store, where a man he had known for years mentioned casually that public gestures could complicate business relationships, and another added that widows often misunderstood kindness when it was not kept discreet. Lucas answered neither insult nor defense. He simply paid for his supplies and left, because explaining his intentions to men who preferred comfort over fairness would not change their view. Margaret felt the pressure differently, wrapped in soft warnings delivered with lowered voices. A customer at her shop commented that it must be difficult to accept gifts without promising more in return, and another suggested that Lucas deserved a woman without a history heavy enough to drag him backward. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were spoken with the calm confidence of people who believed they were protecting social order. When Lucas arrived that afternoon, as he had said he would, he entered the shop openly, nodding to passers-by without apology, and the simple act of returning unsettled more than the original gesture had. Margaret met him at the counter, telling him she had heard enough in a single morning to understand the direction this would take, and she asked him plainly whether he was willing to risk reputation for something the town had already labeled unnecessary. Lucas replied that reputation built on ignoring injustice was not worth preserving, and if choosing her disturbed people, then perhaps what they were protecting deserved disturbance. The firmness in his answer steadied her, but also deepened her worry, because she understood how towns operated. They did not attack loudly at first. They squeezed slowly until resistance felt exhausting. Later that evening, the cafe owner approached Lucas privately, advising him that attention could damage business, and that Valentine's Day would soon be forgotten if he allowed it to fade naturally. Lucas listened without interruption, and said only that forgetting was precisely what he refused to do. Meanwhile, whispers thickened into subtle suggestions that Margaret should consider declining further visits for his sake, that independence required sacrifice, and that gratitude did not obligate permanence. Margaret wrestled with those words long after closing her shop, aware that protecting him might mean stepping back herself. When Lucas walked her home at dusk, she told him she did not wish to become the reason he lost standing in a community he had built his life in. and he answered calmly that standing meant little if it required stepping aside while someone was quietly diminished. The simplicity of his conviction unsettled her because it left no room for compromise. As night settled over the town, Margaret realized that the first test of their unspoken connection would not come from grand confrontation, but from whether one of them chose to retreat to restore comfort. The day had revealed something sharper than gossip. The town was not angry enough to attack, but uneasy enough to push, and she sensed that the real question now was not whether Lucas would choose her once, but whether he would continue choosing her when doing so no longer felt easy. Margaret did not sleep easily that night, because the quiet weight of the town's judgment pressed harder than open insult ever could, and by morning she had convinced herself that protecting Lucas meant doing the very thing she had once resented, removing herself from view. When he arrived at her shop, as he had promised, hat in hand and expression unchanged, she met him at the door before he could step inside, telling him gently that perhaps it would be wiser if he did not visit so openly for a while. Lucas studied her face carefully, not searching for doubt, but for fear, and he found both. She explained that the town had begun to talk not only about her, but about his motives, his business, his judgment, and she would not be the reason he lost respect earned over years of steady work. Lucas listened without interruption, allowing her words to settle fully before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice remained calm but carried something firmer than before. He asked whether she truly wished him to step back, or whether she wished the town would step back instead. The question caught her off guard, because it forced her to confront the difference between choice and pressure. Margaret admitted that she was tired of being discussed like a problem to manage, yet she feared that continuing would make him the next subject of correction. Lucas told her quietly that correction only worked when the person corrected accepted the premise, and he did not. The steadiness of that refusal unsettled her resolve, but she pressed on, saying that gratitude did not entitle her to risk his future. Lucas responded that what he felt was not entitlement and not gratitude. It was intention, and intention did not vanish because others grew uncomfortable. A pair of women passing on the boardwalk slowed their pace to listen, pretending to admire fabric in the window, and Margaret felt the heat of scrutiny rise again. She stepped slightly aside, lowering her voice, urging him to consider that sometimes dignity meant withdrawing before damage was done. Lucas shook his head once and told her that withdrawing would confirm every whisper already forming, and that he had not crossed that café floor to retreat at the first sign of resistance. The firmness in his posture made it clear that this was not stubborn pride, but measured conviction. Margaret's resolve faltered under the weight of his certainty, because part of her feared losing him more than losing reputation. She told him she would not forgive herself if the town turned on him the way it had turned on her, and he answered simply that he was not fragile. The exchange drew more attention than either intended, and by afternoon the rumor had shifted from whether he would step back to whether she had asked him to. That shift unsettled Margaret even more, because it proved that silence would not protect anyone. When Lucas prepared to leave, he paused and said he would return tomorrow as he always had, not to defy the town but to remain consistent. And consistency, he believed, was stronger than confrontation. Margaret watched him walk away with her heart divided between relief and dread, knowing she had tried to protect him by stepping aside, only to discover that he had no intention of allowing her to disappear again. The next morning, Lucas did not arrive at her shop quietly. He arrived at the busiest hour of the day, when the boardwalk carried the full weight of town traffic and every window reflected movement. Margaret saw him from inside, shoulders squared, pace steady, not hurried and not hesitant, and she understood instantly that whatever decision he had made during the night had been final. He stepped into the shop as customers browsed fabric, removed his hat, and greeted her with the same calm tone he used in private, giving no sign that anything between them required secrecy. Conversations thinned as women pretended to inspect lace more closely than necessary, and Margaret felt the old reflex to soften the moment, to speak first, to reduce attention before it sharpened. Lucas spoke before she could. He asked if she would join him for supper that evening at the café, publicly, at the front table, at the same hour as the Valentine gathering, and his voice carried just far enough to ensure that no one could misunderstand the invitation. The air shifted again, but this time the silence held anticipation rather than ridicule. Margaret's pulse quickened, not from embarrassment, but from the knowledge that this was no longer a quiet continuation. This was deliberate reaffirmation. A woman near the counter coughed lightly and remarked that some gestures lost their novelty quickly, and Lucas turned his head slightly toward the sound without changing expression. He said that novelty was not what concerned him. Consistency was. The firmness of that reply removed the suggestion that he might retreat later when attention cooled. Margaret understood what he was doing. He was anchoring the choice in repetition, not impulse. If she accepted, she would no longer be a widow momentarily noticed, but a woman steadily chosen. If she refused, it would not protect him. It would confirm that pressure worked. The weight of the decision settled between them, and for a brief second she considered saying no, not because she wished to, but because she feared the consequences of saying yes. Then she looked at him and saw no doubt, only patience. He was not asking her to prove anything. He was offering her a place beside him in daylight. Margaret answered clearly that she would join him. The words traveled through the room more sharply than any whisper had, and for a moment no one moved. Lucas inclined his head slightly, not triumphant, not relieved, simply acknowledging the agreement, and left the shop without further display. As soon as the door closed behind him, conversation resumed with new urgency, speculation spreading faster than fabric being measured. Margaret felt the tremor of exposure, but also something steadier beneath it. A sense that this was no longer about resisting gossip, but about building something durable in spite of it. That evening would not simply be supper. It would be a declaration repeated in the same space where doubt had first surfaced. The town had attempted to correct him quietly, and he had answered not with argument, but with visibility. Margaret realized that what frightened people most was not romance, but resolve, and as she prepared herself for the supper that would follow, she understood that the choice Lucas had made in daylight had just forced the entire town to decide whether it would continue whispering, or finally learn to accept what it had witnessed twice. That evening the café filled earlier than usual, not because of celebration, but because anticipation drew people who claimed they had errands nearby, and Margaret felt every glance as she entered beside Lucas and walked to the same front table without hesitation. He pulled out her chair with no flourish, sat across from her as before, and ordered supper in the same even tone he used any other night, refusing to perform or defend the moment. The steadiness of it unsettled the room more than spectacle would have, because repetition removed the excuse that the first gesture had been impulse. Margaret kept her posture straight and her voice calm, though she knew the real test wasn't whether she could endure attention, but whether she could endure being seen again after years of choosing safety over exposure. Halfway through the meal, Mrs. Dalton approached their table under the polite pretense of conversation and asked gently whether Margaret truly believed it wise to begin something new when the memory of her husband remained so recent in town minds. The question was framed as concern, but it carried accusation beneath it, and Margaret understood that silence now would allow others to shape her story again. She set down her fork and answered clearly that 5 years of working alone, paying debts alone, and grieving alone had not been hesitation, but loyalty, and that loyalty did not require permanent erasure. The café quieted at the firmness in her voice. She admitted openly that fear of judgment had kept her smaller than she wished to be, and that she had allowed others to define what widowhood meant simply because arguing felt exhausting. Lucas did not interrupt or defend her. He watched her speak with the same steady attention he had shown from the beginning, and that silent support strengthened rather than overshadowed her. Margaret continued, explaining that she had not asked for rescue and did not need protection from kindness, only the freedom to accept it without shame. The clarity of her words shifted something in the room because they removed the illusion that she was being persuaded or pressured. When she finished, she looked at Lucas not for approval, but for partnership, and he met her gaze with quiet pride that did not need expression. Mrs. Dalton had no reply strong enough to counter honesty spoken without bitterness, and she returned to her table more subdued than before. Conversation resumed slowly, but it carried a different tone now, less certain, less corrective. Margaret realized that speaking plainly about her own life had done more than defend the present. It had dismantled the narrative that had confined her since her husband's death. Lucas reached for his coffee and said simply that he had never doubted her strength, only her willingness to let others see it. The remark was not flattery, it was recognition. As the meal ended and they rose together without hurry, the café no longer felt like a courtroom, but like an ordinary room again, and Margaret understood that the greatest shift had not been in public opinion, but in herself. She had carried her truth alone for years, believing it safer to remain quiet. Yet tonight she had placed it on the table in front of everyone, and nothing had collapsed. For the first time since becoming a widow, she did not feel defined by absence. And as Lucas walked beside her into the cool evening air, she sensed that whatever future awaited them would be built not on defiance alone, but on the courage she had finally allowed herself to show. The morning after their public supper did not bring confrontation. It brought something quieter and far more unsettling to those who had expected drama. Normalcy. Lucas rode past the general store as he always did, tipped his hat as he always had, and continued on toward his ranch without addressing the previous evening, and the lack of spectacle left the town with nothing dramatic to resist. Margaret opened her dress shop at the usual hour, windows clean, fabrics displayed neatly, posture steady, and when the first customer entered, she did not sense pity or curiosity as sharply as before. She sensed uncertainty. The gossip that had once felt unified now seemed scattered because repetition had stripped it of urgency. A woman who had once avoided conversation lingered longer at the counter, complimented a finished gown, and mentioned casually that Lucas had always been reliable, as if adjusting her memory to fit what she now accepted. By midday, the boardwalk hummed with routine business, and though glances still followed Margaret, they lacked the sharpness of judgment. Lucas stopped by in the afternoon, carrying a small parcel of thread she had mentioned needing, handed it to her without ceremony, and discussed the weather in the same tone he might use with any neighbor. The ordinariness of the exchange communicated more clearly than declarations could have. This was not rebellion. It was continuity. A ranch hand who had once mocked the Valentine gesture now greeted Lucas with a hesitant nod, testing whether hostility would be returned, and when Lucas responded calmly, the tension dissolved without confrontation. Margaret felt the shift gradually, like winter loosening its grip without announcement. No one apologized publicly for past whispers, but fewer people repeated them, and the silence that had once isolated her began to feel like space rather than absence. That evening, as she closed her shop, the cafe owner stepped outside and remarked that he hoped to see them again soon, not as spectacle, but as regular guests, and the invitation carried the quiet admission that resistance had lost its footing. Lucas did not celebrate the change. He simply continued showing up, and Margaret realized that persistence had accomplished what argument never could. The town had expected discomfort to drive him away, but instead it had forced everyone to watch consistency unfold. Days passed with smaller talk and fewer sideways glances, and what had once been a disruption slowly blended into the rhythm of ordinary life. Margaret no longer measured each outing by the number of whispers she heard, and Lucas no longer needed to prove his choice through repetition. It had become assumed. The absence that once marked her Valentine's Day table had been replaced not by spectacle, but by steady presence, and the steadiness unsettled no one anymore. As the sun set one evening and they walked past the cafe window together, Margaret noticed that no one paused their conversation to watch them pass. The realization carried more relief than applause ever could, because it meant the town had finally moved from scrutiny to acceptance. What had begun as a single decision in a crowded room had reshaped quiet habits across an entire street. And Margaret understood that love did not need to win loudly to endure. It only needed to remain visible long enough for doubt to lose interest. By early spring, the town had stopped measuring them, and the change felt less like approval and more like exhaustion. People had simply run out of reasons to object. Lucas still came by the shop most afternoons, sometimes to bring supplies, sometimes only to sit and mend a saddle strap while Margaret worked, and the quiet companionship had grown so natural that it no longer required explanation. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden gestures meant to prove anything. Instead, there were small habits forming: shared suppers, early morning walks before business began, conversations about crops and fabrics and the shape of next season. Margaret realized that the fear she once carried had thinned into something almost unrecognizable, replaced by anticipation that felt steady rather than fragile. One evening, as they stood outside the shop watching dusk settle across the street, Lucas asked her what she wanted from the years ahead, not in the tone of a man seeking agreement, but in the tone of someone prepared to build around her answer. The question startled her because it contained no assumption. She admitted she wanted a home that did not echo, work that did not feel like survival, and companionship that did not disappear when attention shifted. Lucas listened without interruption, and when she finished, he said that those were reasonable desires, and that he would like to be part of them, if she wished it. There was no kneeling, no crowd, no audience to validate the moment, only the quiet certainty in his voice. Margaret understood then that he had not rushed this step because he wanted her to reach it without pressure. She asked him whether he feared that commitment would stir old whispers again, and he answered that whispers had already lost their influence once. They would not regain it now. The simplicity of his confidence felt stronger than romance, and she found herself smiling not from surprise but from recognition. She told him she did not want to be chosen once and remembered occasionally. She wanted to be chosen daily, even when seasons changed and excitement faded. Lucas replied that consistency had always been his strength. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before he finally asked whether she would consider building that future with him. Not as rescue, not as defiance, but as partnership. Margaret felt the weight of the question settled gently rather than heavily, and she realized she no longer needed to calculate risk. She answered yes without hesitation, not because Valentine's Day had begun something impulsive, but because every ordinary day since had proven it durable. The street behind them remained quiet, unaware that a decision far more lasting than a public gesture had just been made. As they walked home together under the soft glow of lantern light, Margaret understood that the most meaningful moments in her life had not come with applause, but with calm certainty. And Lucas's question, asked without urgency and answered without fear, marked the true turning point of her story. The following Valentine's Day arrived without announcement, no heavier than any other winter morning. Yet Margaret woke with a quiet awareness that the date no longer carried the sharp edge it once had. Snow rested lightly along the boardwalk, and the cafe windows glowed warm against the cold air, just as they had a year before. but everything inside her felt different. Lucas did not make a grand show of the day. He simply stood beside her as they entered together, his hand steady at her back, and the room that had once fallen silent in surprise now greeted them with ordinary warmth. The same front table waited, though this time it wasn't empty, and Margaret sat without hesitation, no longer measuring herself against what others held. A few couples smiled toward them in passing, not in curiosity but in acknowledgement, and she realized the town had moved beyond witnessing into acceptance without ever needing a formal declaration. Lucas placed a small parcel in front of her again, wrapped neatly but without spectacle, and when she looked at him, he said only that tradition deserved consistency. She opened it to find not gloves this time, but a simple silver locket, practical and unadorned, and inside rested a tiny pressed flower from the previous spring, saved without her knowing. The gesture was not meant to impress the room. It was meant to remind her of the day he had first decided that she would not be invisible. Margaret felt warmth rise in her chest, not from surprise, but from continuity, and she understood that love built quietly carried more strength than any public defense ever could. The waitress refilled their cups without hesitation. Conversations continued easily around them, and no one paused to measure whether a widow belonged at a Valentine table anymore. Lucas met her gaze across the wood and asked softly whether she remembered how that first afternoon had felt, and she admitted she had felt small, unsure, and almost ready to leave. He answered that he had seen it the moment she stepped into the room, and that seeing had been enough to make a choice. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand openly, not for display but because it felt natural, and she realized that the greatest change had not been in the town's opinion, but in her own certainty. She was no longer waiting to be included. She was included because someone had recognized her worth and refused to let silence erase it. As they finished their meal and stepped back onto the winter street together, Margaret looked once toward the café window and felt no trace of the ache that had once defined the day. The table that had stood empty a year before now existed only in memory, and the memory no longer hurt. Lucas had not rescued her from loneliness. He had simply chosen her in plain sight and continued choosing her until doubt lost its hold. Walking beside him through the quiet afternoon, Margaret understood that she would never again measure her worth by absence, because the silent cowboy who had crossed a crowded room had given her something lasting, a life where being forgotten was no longer possible, and a love steady enough that Valentine's Day would never find her alone again. She didn't ask to be chosen. He chose her anyway. Do you think quiet love is stronger than loud romance? Tell me what you would have done in that cafe. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe Native American Tales for more frontier tales where dignity wins, courage stands quiet, and love is earned, not announced.